Welcome to Real World Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield. You're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz in Houston and around the world, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial and KTSUradio.com. Now, let me take care of a couple of housekeeping matters because I want to get right to our show on tonight. First of all, if you'd like to follow me during the week, you can follow me on Instagram at DZ Cofield. You can follow me on Facebook at DZ Cofield, and you can follow me on Twitter at, you guessed it, DZ Cofield. In the midst of everything that is going on, I just need some feel-good stories. I've got to be honest with you. It's hard to watch the news, y'all, because it just seems to be one bad thing after another, whether it's COVID or the economy or the cold storm that we had come through Houston and the thousands of families that have been adversely affected by this cold storm. I just need some good news. And I was watching ESPN, and man, there was an interview that just, when I say lifted my spirit, it just took me back to some bygone days. I grew up loving baseball. I grew up loving baseball because my grandfather loved baseball and my father loved baseball. And my grandfather was one of those guys growing up in Brooklyn. He was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. We didn't live far from Ebbets Field. And then when the Dodgers left before the Mets were formed as an expansion team, he grudgingly and reluctantly rooted for the Yankees. And I can remember after the Mets were formed, he would literally have baseball on the radio and baseball on the television. He would watch one and listen to the other. And I went to more baseball games than I can shake a stick at. Every bat day, every ball day, every cap day, you name it, I was there. I go way back to when you could bring food into the stadium. And I can remember my grandmother packing that cooler full of fried chicken and potato salad and cake and soda that was put in the freezer and wrapped it up in aluminum foil. That was prior to koozie. And man, just remember those days going to see players like Dick Allen and Roberto Clemente and other players like that. And this gentleman was on, and it was during Black History Month, talking about the Negro Leagues and the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And I said, man, I've got to see if we can get him on Real World Real Talk. Now, I've got to tell you, this is a commitment I've made, y'all. It may not make sense to you, but it makes perfect sense to me. Our society has designated February as Black History Month, and it is seen to be not just okay, but expected for the mass of our country to stop and pay homage and tribute to African Americans and our history. But guess what? I'm like, why do we need to tell or listen to them to tell us when we can celebrate our history? Especially being on the campus of a HBCU, I'm like, you know what? We need to celebrate our own history. Man, my grandmother used to say, it's a poor dog that won't wag its own tail. And so I know it's March, but guess what? Every day is Black History for me. And today I am excited to welcome to Real World Real Talk our guest. He is the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. He's been in that position now almost 10 years. He has been affiliated with the museum 27 years, and man, just has a wealth of information. And I can't wait to talk to him because he's just making me think about my dad, my granddad, and all of the stories that they would tell. That's none other than Bob Kendrick. Bob Kendrick, welcome to Real World Real Talk.
Hey, Doc, thanks so much for having me, man. It's an honor. And you were making me hungry. You had me flashing back to when I was a kid in Georgia, and my mother would make that fried chicken, and she would pack it in a shoebox.
Yes, sir.
That shoebox was lined with wax paper, and I don't know what it was about that shoebox. That was the Tupperware, and it was the best fried chicken ever. Man. In that shoebox with that wax paper lining that box, man.
Look here, I had somebody laughing, man. I remember we were getting on the train in Birmingham, Alabama. We were getting on the train and we were going north. And my great grandmother, Sadie Thomas Collins, packed a lunch for me. And I'm gonna take you back. It was a neck bone sandwich, a neck bone on a big in the middle of a cat head biscuit. And man, you talk.
They don't know what you're talking about.
Man,
Your audience has no idea what you're talking about, but they should.
Man, listen, man, and I can remember them laughing at me because I ate it before we got to the train station. All right. And they always told you, eat that potato salad before it goes bad. You better eat it before it goes bad. Bob, let me tell you, your interview on ESPN was, for me, just a joy to hear, in part because it not only took our minds for a moment off of COVID-19 and the economic, upheaval in our country and the social unrest, but man, it just took me back to a really, really great time of my life. It just reminded me of those great times. And one of the statements that was made was Black America's journey toward equality through the game of baseball. That baseball, in a very real sense, has been a microcosm of what's been wrong and at times what's been right in our country. And I want you to talk about just the historical impact of baseball and why this museum is so important, man. I'm ready to take a road trip. My wife has been on me to take a road trip. And I came by the museum one time and I was there for a convention and I said, I got to get back. And that's been years ago. I never got a chance to go through it, but I've got to tell you, man, in going through the website, I'm like, you know what? I've got to make that trip because I'm looking forward to getting on that field of legends and seeing those stars. Talk about why this museum is so important, because we have a generation of young people and some older people
absolutely
don't know the significance of the Negro leagues in terms of baseball history.
Yeah, you're right, Doc. They don't. And it's eye-opening for a lot of people who come here. And I tell people the story of the Negro Leagues is America at her worst, but it's also America at her triumphant best, because it's so easy for folks to dwell on the social adversity that confronted these athletes as part of their journey wanting to play baseball in this country. And we sometimes lose sight of the fact that they overcame that adversity. And so here we don't focus as much on the adversity, we focus on what they did to overcome the adversity. So yeah, the conditions in our country that required a need for a Negro Leagues is sorrowful and shameful. Segregation will always be a shameful part of this country's history. But out of segregation rose this wonderful story of triumph and conquest. And Doc, is based on one small, simple principle. You won't let me play with you in the major leagues? Then I'll just create a league of my own.
Yeah.
That league, the Negro Leagues, was established right here in Kansas City. As a matter of fact, just a stone's throw from my office. Yeah, right around the corner, the Paseo YMCA is where a Texan from Calvert, Texas, Andrew Root Foster, led a contingent of 8 independent Black baseball team owners into a meeting that was held at the Paseo YMCA. Out of that meeting came the birth of the Negro National League, the first successful organized Black baseball league. The Negro Leagues would then go on to operate amazingly for 40 years, man, from 1920 until 1960. And as you can well imagine, that surprises most, because most people who come here at least have the baseline understanding that Jackie Robinson breaks baseball's color barrier in 1947. And I think the assumption is if Robinson breaks the color barrier in 47, if there was a Negro Leagues, surely it must have ended in and around that time. Right. Well, the leagues operated for another 13 years. Why? Because it took Major League Baseball 12 years before every Major League team had at least one Black baseball player. The Boston Red Sox would become the last team to integrate in 1959. And so here in Kansas City, we tell that story. We bring that story to life of what they were able to do in the face of that adversity. And I think that's why people leave so inspired. It is as compelling and inspirational story as you will ever encounter.
I tell you, one of the things that struck me, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. Because man, there's so much I want to talk about. Let's start with the man that many people think black baseball started with, and that's Jackie Robinson.
Yeah.
And what many people don't know, and my father told me this years ago, and you reiterated this in your statements as well, that Jackie Robinson was not the best baseball player in the Negro Leagues, arguably was not the best player on his own team, the Kansas City Monarchs.
Yeah.
He was the right player.
It's right player.
Because of his attitude, because of his aptitude. He was one of several that could have been the right player. And I know you talk about Monty Irvin being one of those players that could have been the player as well. So let's talk about before Jackie, and then we'll talk about after Jackie Robinson. Before Jackie Robinson, we're talking about what, 20, 25 years of baseball that is played at the highest of levels. I mean, these are guys that were phenomenal athletes. You know, when you hear the stories, sometimes you might, think maybe there's a little hyperbole. You know what I mean? And it may have been, I don't know, but man, these guys were phenomenal players. They were phenomenal athletes, and they played a phenomenal level of baseball.
Yes, they did. And they could play. They could play. And really, the major leaguers knew that they could play.
Right.
I tell people all the time, it was more than just the conditions of our time, the social conditions of our time that kept them out of Major League Baseball. Fear was as prevalent as anything. We're talking about job security, self-preservation.
Yeah.
And so, they were in no hurry to see this influx of great black and brown, because you had these Spanish-speaking athletes playing in the Negro leagues as well. And so if you're that average major leaguer, you're in no hurry to see these guys come in because I might lose my job. And you can understand that. That's human nature. There was only 16 teams in the major leagues at that time. And so these were great jobs. And so you want to try to be protective of what is yours. But as you well know, the only way you can measure how good you are is by competing with and against the very best. And so, no, they could play. And there's lore and legend around these athletes. Some of them are almost mythical-like. When you start talking about the power of Josh Gibson and the speed of Cool Papa Bell. But as I tell people, it's mythical-like, but Gibson's power was very real.
Man.
This man is arguably, Doc, the greatest combination of power and average this sport has ever seen. My dear friend, the late, great John Buck O'Neill. Matter of fact, the last time I was in Houston, I was with Buck. And that's been a while. I got to hurry up and get back down to Houston again. But he would describe Josh in this manner. He says he had the eyes of Ted Williams and the power of Babe Ruth rolled into one dynamic package. And Gibson's outs, as we would say in this sport, were loud outs. He didn't strike out a lot. He put the ball in play, and he put it in play with a lot of power. And so I guess you could say they had the early version of a shift starting way back in the Negro Leagues, because when Gibson was at the plate, the third baseman and the shortstop were almost in left field, man, because you could get killed creeping up on Josh. And then he was putting up these big numbers as a catcher, which, as you know, is virtually unheard of.
Yeah.
With catching, you're going to get one or the other, power, maybe average, but you're not going to get both because the position's so physically demanding. Beat somebody up. And as we talk all the time, Josh wasn't a good catcher. He was a great catcher, rifle arm. So he's throwing guys out from the crouch back in that era. And if you didn't have a great arm playing catching in the Negro League, you had no shot. They ran too well. Yeah. So the catching position in the Negro Leagues, to be quite frank, in my estimation, was far superior than it was in the Major Leagues, but it didn't transition into the major league because it's that cerebral position.
Yeah.
And so Gibson had a great arm. Buck O'Neil said he had complete control of his pitching staff, so he called a great game, and believe it or not, was a good running catcher. So he gonna steal you 20, 25 bases or more to go with that big bat of his. And folks, the man swung a 40-ounce, 41-inch bat.
Dude, that's a piece of lumber.
That's lumber, man. You got to be a man. You got to be a man to do that.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And so he was absolutely, I tell people all the time, if you want to get a gauge for Josh Gibson, his physique, who he looked like physically, think Bo Jackson as a catcher. That's Josh Gibson.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting you say that, because I think a lot of people's interest in Josh Gibson was piqued when your friend Buck O'Neil made the statement and Bo Jackson hit a ball at Royal Stadium, and he said he hadn't heard a ball come off a bat like that since Josh Gibson. And anybody who knows, man, Bo Jackson is one of the most phenomenal athletes that this country has ever produced, and his ability to play multiple sports is just legendary. And those of us who saw him do it thought it was like mythical when he did it.
and you know what? That's exactly what we're talking about with the athletes in the Negro Leagues. If you had not seen Bo Jackson and people told you about these people,
right.
And the exact same thing, I don't know about that.
Right. You're right.
Exactly the case with it that it was with the guys in the Negro Leagues. You know, you think about this, Doc. We just lost Henry Aaron, who is my all-time favorite Major League ball player, my childhood idol as a kid growing up in Georgia. If somebody had told you there'd be this skinny kid from Mobile, Alabama, that would hit 755 home runs, who grew up hitting cross-handed as a kid, nobody would believe you.
Right.
And that he would stop on the way to get to the major leagues in the Negro Leagues with the Indianapolis Clowns. And so a lot of this, with the Negro Leagues, because people didn't necessarily see it, they don't want to believe it. And so when I'm telling them these stories, they are all respectful. You know, they look at me like, well, you know, Bob, okay, they were good, but I don't know if they're as good as you say they were.
Right.
And then you get to this photograph. And it's my favorite photograph in the entire museum of a young Henry Aaron standing at the train station at Mobile, Alabama. Doc, he must have weighed 150 pounds soaking wet. And he's about to leave to go join the Indianapolis Clowns. As I mentioned, a skinny, cross-handed hitting shortstop. And folks, if you haven't heard the term cross-handed, in Henry Aaron's case, he was a right-hand hitter who was hitting with his left hand on top. That is unorthodox. The fear is that you break your wrist hitting in that manner. Well, Henry Aaron is knocking the cover off the baseball in a highly unorthodox fashion. When he gets to the Clowns, they didn't want to tinker with this kid's swing. So they reluctantly put the right hand on top, and the rest, as we say, is history. But just think about this. If Jackie doesn't break the color barrier, we never see Henry Aaron in the major leagues, and no one would have believed that this kid was that good. 755 home runs later, and as I tell people, the most phenomenal stat to me is if you took away all 755 home runs, he still got over 3,000 hits. You know, and so you would not have believed that this kind of player ever existed. And that's kind of the way people look at the Negro Leagues before 1947 and Jackie breaking the color barrier. But these guys could play. And it's scary to think that there just might have been some players better than Henry Aaron and Willie Mays who never got the chance to play in Major League Baseball.
No, absolutely. You know, I was thinking, you know, if somebody is telling the story, even in the next 10 years, tell the story today of Bo Jackson running up the fence.
and running up the fence was one thing. He ran back down.
Running back down and, you know, throwing a person out at home plate from center field on the fly from the warning track.
My friend Harold Reynolds. And Harold and I joke about and laugh about, and what people forget, Doc, is that Harold Reynolds could run.
He could run.
Harold could run.
Yes, sir.
And Harold could not believe when they were telling him to get down. And Bo throws an absolute laser from the warning track.
Yeah.
On the fly.
Again,
if you were to tell somebody, they were like, "Oh, that never happened," but we got film of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And, you think he had his accident before I was able to see him, but my grandfather and my father would talk about the greatness of Roy Campanella, and there are those as great as Roy Campanella was, and I think he still has the Major League Baseball record for throwing out the highest percentage of people attempting to steal against him. And they said, man, he couldn't carry Josh's jockstrap. I mean, he couldn't carry his bag.
He never started an East-West All-Star game because of Josh Gibson. And Campy goes on to become a 3-time MVP in Major League Baseball. And the most remarkable thing to me about Roy Campanella is, Doc, he started playing in the Negro Leagues when he was 15 years old.
Right.
Now, this is not your normal 15-year-old. He was like a full-grown man at 15 physically.
Yeah.
And the great catcher, a guy who has Texas ties, Raleigh Biz Mackey, took a young Roy Campanella under his wing and taught him the art of catching. And if Roy Campanella was alive today, he'd tell you the greatest defensive catcher this sport has ever seen was a guy named Raleigh Biz Mackey. But that again goes back to what I was telling you about how dominant the catching position was in the Negro Leagues. One of my favorite stories is there was a guy named Mickey Taborn. And Mickey Taborn was a catcher, Doc, for the Monarchs. And you know how when the batter puts the ball in play, the catcher's supposed to go back up first base.
Right.
Well, Mickey Taborn used to beat the runner to the bag from his catching position. And fans would just be double over in laughter because they were so excited about him putting on this demonstration. You just had these amazing guys who were great signal callers. But again, the stereotypical depiction was we weren't smart enough to play that position. Yeah. So you didn't see us basically as catchers, pitchers, and shortstops.
Yeah.
No, just didn't happen.
I want you to talk a little bit about the innovations that came out of Negro Leagues baseball, because, when I heard the story, and, I love the phrase, history is his story. And you got to learn how to tell your own story, right? If you want the story to be told right. And I want you to tell the story around the creation of night baseball, because there are those who have the major league story. As what was done in the Negro Leagues was minor league. But talk about J.L. Wilkinson and the Kansas City Monarchs and the start of
night baseball.
Yeah.
No, well, our history book is going to tell us that the first professional night baseball game was in 1935, Cincinnati, Ohio, Cincinnati Reds versus Philadelphia Phillies. Well, the history book is wrong. The first professional night baseball game, Doc, 1930, and it featured our very own Kansas City Monarchs. J.L. Wilkinson, as you mentioned, literally mortgaged everything he had to pioneer night baseball. Portable generated light towers. So not only could they play a night game here in Kansas City, he could load them up on the truck and they could play a night game virtually anywhere. And Wilkinson wasn't doing this to be innovative. He was doing it for survival. You see, back then, the Negro Leagues had been primarily relegated to playing on Sundays. Major League Baseball really didn't play on Sundays, so the Negro Leagues would more times than not rent the ballpark and play that Sunday doubleheader. We left church, going straight to the ballpark. dressed to the nines, as they used to say.
Yeah.
And Wilkinson was looking for a way to get the working class fan into the ballpark. And so night baseball became the answer. Night baseball would become bigger than Sunday games. And folks, Sunday games were so popular that black churches would move their service time up an hour. And I don't even have to tell you, because if you know anything about the black church,
Yes, sir.
It's service time. No, man, 11 o'clock Sunday go to meeting, but when the Monarchs were home, service would start at 10 o'clock. Everybody filed out, going to that Sunday doubleheader, looking pretty. Night baseball became even bigger than that. But as I oftentimes share with my young audience, what it is it's a fact that if you don't control the pen, you don't control the story.
Yeah.
So your story is never written with the kind of accuracy or relevancy that it should be. Our museum is about taking control of the pen and finally telling the story the way it should have been told years ago. But you know, the other thing that I see from those who come to visit, and Doc, I don't care what color they may be, we want the truth. People really do. They want the truth. And American historians have done us a tremendous disservice. They kept this wonderful piece of baseball and Americana away from us. So countless generations of us have gone through our own formal educations without knowing one of the most significant chapters, again, not in baseball history, but in American history.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, we don't like the fact as Americans that somebody arbitrarily tried to decide what you and I get to learn. And so for us, our overarching goal is to rewrite the pages of American history books. There are gaps. We all know that. There are gaps in the pages of history books. But until we can rewrite those pages, then these kinds of cultural institutions like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, they are so vitally important to help bridge those gaps.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield, and we have with us live in the studio, Mr. Bob Kendrick, the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. You know, there was a lot of fanfare over the Angels signing Shohei Ohtani, you know, and this whole idea of, man, you know, he can pitch and he can hit, as if he was the first person that was ever able to do that. I remember in New York, Doc Gooden, you know, pleaded with the Mets to let him bat left-handed because he was a natural left-handed hitter and they wanted to protect his right arm and they didn't want him to. And then you have the story of a guy like Martin Dihigo.
Yes.
El Maestro, I think he right. This Cuban who you describe as playing all 9 positions, and these guys, there wasn't no 3-4 days rest. You know, you're not gonna pitch on your off day. I mean, these guys took the ball and they went out and played because these were players. Talk about this man who has set history in terms of even just his Hall of Fame inductions and things like that.
No, he's one of the greatest baseball players that most fans don't know a thing about it. And that is the great Martin Dihigo. Nicknamed him El Maestro, the master, because he could indeed do it all. Played all 9 positions, played all 9 of them well. He is the only baseball player in the history of our sport to be enshrined into 5 different countries' baseball halls of fame. He's in the Mexican, Cuban, Venezuelan, Dominican, and in Cooperstown. 1 year, Doc, in the Mexican League, Dihigo wins the pitching title. He goes 19-2 with an 0.90 ERA. He hits .387 that same season and won the batting title. You know, he's 6'3", 6'4", movie star, good looks. I mean, he had everything that you needed to be a star. Now, if you come out of Cuba, you likely know the name Martin Dihigo. I'll never forget the Chicago White Sox, Kenny Williams, who at that time was a general manager of the White Sox when they won the World Series in 2005. And we honored him with the Ruth Foster Award as Executive of the Year. Well, he promised. He looked out in the audience as he was accepting the award, and he looked at my friend Buck O'Neil and said, when the White Sox return to Kansas City next year, I'm bringing the entire team to visit the Negro Leagues Museum. And he lived up to his word. The first Major League team to ever bring all of their players were the Chicago White Sox. And I'm sure some of the guys probably came kicking and screaming on their off day, didn't necessarily want to be there, but when once they got there, they absolutely loved it. But one of the greatest memories of that visit was Jose Contreras, a Cuban who was a relief pitcher for the White Sox. And when Jose Contreras walks in the museum and he sees his fellow countrymen standing there in a life-size statue at home plate, he just lit up. Yeah, he just lit up. And you could see the pride emanating from him. But it also speaks to that bond that the Negro Leagues had with Spanish-speaking countries. When we went to those countries, and we were the first Americans to go to many of those countries, man, we were treated like heroes. We stayed in the finest hotels, ate in the finest restaurants, come back home, and you were treated like a second-class citizen. But the Spanish-speaking athlete couldn't play in the major leagues either, so they found sanctuary playing in the Negro Leagues.
Yeah. I want you to talk a little bit about a man who, I'm not even going to say arguably, my father said was the best baseball player of all time, and that's Willie Mays. He felt like if Willie Mays did not get drafted into the Army in his prime, that Willie Mays would have broken the home run record. Willie Mays would have, Willie Mays was a guy who, in his opinion, would have been the first 40-40 man if he chose to be. He just didn't choose to, but, when people were making a big deal about Bonds and, 40-40 and, oh man, you can't, man, that's unreachable and all. And he was like, man, guys from the Negro Leagues, man, they could have done that with their eyes closed, And he talked about Willie Mays. I want you to talk a little bit about Willie Mays, if you will, who is still alive and still with us.
He's still with us, God bless his soul. I mean, it's incredible. Willie, I think, will turn 90 this year. And Willie comes to the Birmingham Black Barons dock 17 years old, patrolling center field for the Birmingham Black Barons. And he's 17 years old. This is a kid playing with grown men. And it's the same thing that Henry Aaron told me. He says when he left Mobile, he didn't know if he was leaving home to go play with kids his own age or grown men. As you well know, they were playing with grown men. Henry and Willie Mays won a World Series while playing for the Birmingham Black Barons. And then, of course, he would be signed by the New York Giants. And Willie Mays, you're right. If he doesn't get drafted, he would have broken Ruth's home run record. He was, as Buck O'Neil described him, a beautiful ball player. And most still regard him as the greatest all-around baseball player ever. Willie Mays, certainly the greatest major leaguer. Willie Mays could do everything. 5-tool guy, hit for power, hit for average, could field, could run, could throw, and he did it with a flair.
Yeah.
He did everything with a flair, and there was a grace about him, though, and he never got booed, even in the opposing team's stadiums. That is how beloved Willie Mays was, because we remember this guy walking through Harlem playing stickball with the kids. That effervescent personality that made him the say hey kid. And it all starts in the Negro Leagues. It all starts in the Negro Leagues.
Yeah, you tell the story, and I've got to tell you, man, I envy you for the time that you got to spend with Buck O'Neil, because, man, and I want to talk a little bit about him later on, but Buck O'Neil said that Willie Mays was the greatest major leaguer he had seen, but he wasn't the greatest player he had ever seen. I want you to talk about the person that he said was the greatest player that he had ever seen in his life.
Oscar Charleston, the Hoosier Comet from Indianapolis, Indiana. Buck O'Neil, as you mentioned, said that Mays was the greatest major league he ever saw, but the greatest baseball player he ever saw was Oscar Charleston. Oscar Charleston was an early era Negro leaguer who could do it all. Same thing, hit for power, hit for average, could field, could run, could throw. In 1921, he led the Negro Leagues in home runs, triples, doubles, stolen bases, and batting average in the same season. If you were going to compare him to a major league contemporary, for those of you who are fans of the history of our sport, he had the defensive abilities of Tris Speaker, the tenacity of Ty Cobb, because he was mean. Now he fight you in a heartbeat. And the power of Babe Ruth rolled into one dynamic package. And Doc, Buck says that Charleston was one of the strongest men he ever saw in his life. He said that Charleston could take a baseball, put it between both palms, and turn the leather on the baseball. Just freakishly strong. Yeah, I mean, he said never saw a center fielder, including Mays, that could go back on a ball the way Charleston could. Just had uncanny instincts. He just seemed to know where that ball was coming off the bat, right off the crack of the bat. And so he played a very shallow center field. So you couldn't bloop it in front of him. And unless you hit it on a rope, you couldn't get it over his head. He would just track it. And I tell the story all the time of Mays making that legendary catch in the World Series.
Right.
The great over-the-shoulder basket catch.
Works, yeah.
Ground where he literally ran a country mile to make that catch. And quite frankly, the throw was better than the catch. Yeah, he doubles off the runner, but everybody remembers the catch because of the magnitude of the moment. And like I said, he covered so much ground there in the Polo Grounds. That's the only place where that ball would have otherwise been over the fence everywhere else.
Yeah.
But all the old timers in the Negro League say, had that been Oscar Charleston, he'd have been waiting for that ball to come down.
That's amazing. That's amazing. You talk about, and I mentioned earlier, Monty Irvin.
Yes.
And tell our listeners his story. You know, a lot of these people, those of us who were baseball fans in the 60s and 70s saw them at their trailing glory, and maybe more familiar with them in the broadcast booth than we were of them as players. Monty Irvin's one of those. I just remember him as a boy, you know, playing, but he was at the tail end of his career, nowhere near what he was when he played for the Newark Eagles. Talk about the kind of player he was, and then I want you to talk about the kind of person he was as well.
Lived and died right there in Houston. Yeah, he called Houston home over the latter part of his years, and you know, he was one of my favorite people ever. I just feel so blessed, Doc, to have gotten a chance to know people like Buck O'Neil and Monty Irvin. And I tell people, I wish Major League Baseball had gotten Monty Irvin when he was 19, 20 years old, because there was absolutely nothing that Monty Irvin could not do. Same thing, 5'2" guy, movie star, good looks. He had star quality written all over him, and again, was a beautiful ball player. He mentored Willie Mays. Willie looked at Monty almost like a father figure. And so when Monty gets to the New York Giants, he, Willie Mays, and Hank Thompson formed the Majors' first all-black outfield. And so Monty took care of Willie. But Monty could have been the first to break the color barrier. He was the Negro League's owner's choice. If someone were to break the color barrier, they thought it should be Monty Irvin. Got to keep in mind, Monty Irvin, y'all, was a superstar in the Negro Leagues. But Monty had just gotten back from World War II. And Monty was suffering from what they then called shell shock. Today, we would call it post-traumatic syndrome. And he was having contract squabbles with Effa Manley. Effa Manley owned the Newark Eagles. And Effa Manley, Doc, was not a fan of Branch Rickey.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, to put it kindly, she couldn't stand Branch Rickey because she felt that Branch Rickey was going to try to come in and raid the Negro Leagues of talent without compensation, which honestly, that was his plan.
Yeah.
And so Branch really wanted Monty Irvin. But Effa Manley was prepared to fight him. Yeah, she was prepared to fight. And he didn't need a fight on his hand because he needed to do this as stealthily as he possibly could because the other owners otherwise were going to line up and try to block this move, particularly if they knew it was coming. And so he backed off of Monty Irvin and set his sight on Jackie Robinson instead. Jackie was playing here for the Kansas City Monarchs. Jackie gets his tryout for the Monarchs in Houston, Texas in 1945. And little did J.L. Wilkinson know he was signing the man that was ultimately going to put him out of business. And so Branch Rickey literally took Jackie Robinson away from the Kansas City Monarchs, a player who absolutely was under contract.
Yeah.
J.L. Wilkinson never got compensated. But Wilkinson couldn't fight back. He couldn't fight back. Why? Because Wilkie was white. And there was no way that this white man who had made his entire living in black baseball could stand up and protest what every black person on the face of this planet had been waiting for, and that was for a black man to play in the major leagues. So he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. And so publicly he said all the right things, but privately he was seething. And then Monty would ultimately get his chance. He's 30 years old when he gets to the major leagues, and he still has a great major league career. Yeah, and so it just, again, makes you wonder what if. You know, one of my favorite Monty Irvin stories, it is his connection to Roberto Clemente. The great Roberto Clemente idolized Monty Irvin. When Monty played in Puerto Rico, a young Roberto Clemente would carry Monty Irvin's uniform to the ballpark. And if you carried the uniform to the ballpark, the player would let you in the game free. And Roberto Clemente Jr. told me that Monty Irvin gave his dad his first real ball glove, and that that Roberto Clemente, idolized Monty Irvin and wanted to be Monty Irvin. And as I tell people, every hero has a hero. And for the great Roberto Clemente, it was Monty Irvin. And as fate would have it, after Roberto Clemente dies in that tragic plane accident trying to help people in Nicaragua, he and Monty Irvin would be inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame on the same day. And of course, Roberto Clemente posthumously, but he goes in with his idol, Monty Irvin. You know, those are the stories that you seem to only get in baseball. You just get the stories in baseball.
That's unbelievable. My dad would talk about the speed of Cool Papa Bell. One of the coolest names
it is
of all times, of all sports. I mean, but he talked about, man, how fast this guy was. I think everybody has probably heard the story. Some have tried to borrow it and apply it to other people, being so fast that he could turn the light off and be in the bed, pull the covers up before the room went dark. But I love the story that you told, because to me, this is like the proof is in the pudding in the challenge race between him and Jesse Owens.
Yes.
Talk about that a little bit, because I just found it so fascinating, man. Because, you know, if you don't think Cool Papa Bell is fast, ask Jesse Owens.
and Jesse Owens, who at that time was the fastest man in the world, would never race Cool Papa Bell. Cool challenged him on several occasions, and Jesse said, "Well, I don't have my track shoes." Cool said, "I don't have my track shoes either." And let's get it on. And Jesse, Jesse Owens would never race Cool Papa Bell. Flat out refused to race Cool Papa Bell. Jesse Owens would race horses around the bases, but never Cool Papa Bell. And so again, the speed is almost mythical like, but it was very real. You know, Cool once stole 175 bases in a less than 200 game season. He twice, honest to God's truth, twice scored from first base on a bunt in exhibition games against Major League All-Stars. Played like the bunt and run hit and run created, perfected in the Negro League. So the Major Leagues really hadn't seen this. And Buck O'Neil says, Doc, that Cool Papa Bell could literally steal second base standing up. And he didn't take the big lead like the base stealers do today. He took just a walking lead, but after 2 steps, he's at top end. So on the bunt and run, Cool is breaking on the pitch. And so the batter dropped that bunt down the third base line. And so the third baseman and the catcher would converge on it. By the time the third baseman picked it up and started his throw to first base, Cool Papa was rounding third. Now the pitcher, not thinking that anyone would dare try to score, fails to back up home plate, and Cool Papa beats him easily. It happened twice in exhibition games against major leaguers. Once, Satchel Paige is the guy that dropped the bunt. And so now the speed was really, truly legendary. But he wasn't just a great fast guy. He was a great base runner. So he was a great base runner to go with that great speed. And so Buck says he had the uncanny ability to cut the bag on the inside, where most guys got to take that big round turn or they're going to fall over. He says Cool is on the inside and that he would be running so low to the ground. He's left-handed hitter, so he comes out the box running, and said, Doc, that he would be so low to the ground that he could actually smack the bag with his hand and not fall over. You know, as I tell people all the time, now sometimes the good Lord just gives us a little something that he don't give everybody. And he gave Cool something that I don't think he gave too many other people. And Cool used it to dazzle people like no one, you know, ever before. He ran down everything in the outfield. You know, so he didn't have a great throwing arm. He came to the Negro Leagues as a pitcher, but he hurt his arm. And it might have been the greatest thing that ever happened was that he hurt his arm. They converted him to an outfielder. And so he didn't have a great throwing arm, but he had a very quick release. And the speed would track down. He played shallow. He could run down everything. And so he's one of the greatest outfielders in baseball history.
Yeah. Well, listen, I need to let you go because we are out of time, but I am going to continue our conversation with the great Bob Kendrick, president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Man, what tremendous information. He is a repository of stories that he was told by Buck O'Neil and stories that were told to Buck O'Neil and interviews that he's been blessed to do. And it's such a vital part of our history because it represents so much more than just baseball. I mean, I want you to think about this. The Negro Leagues represented entrepreneurship. Rube Foster, who was a Negro League player, who called together and met with 8 owners, and they made the decision that they were going to start a league. That they weren't going to just barnstorm and get in cars and just play pickup games and things like that. But no, they were going to actually formalize baseball. And think about the significance of this. You had owners, you had general managers, you had trainers, you had coaches, you had managers, you had umpires, and then you had a whole economy that was given birth to out of the Negro baseball leagues. I mean, it was the work of Black people at their best. And they had the talent. Oh my God, they had the talent. Because you can argue that the greatest ball players of all time ever came out of the Negro baseball leagues. Jackie Robinson, the right person, but not the best player in the Negro Leagues, even though he's a Hall of Famer in Major League Baseball. Henry Aaron, many call him still the home run champ. Willie Mays, Josh Gibson. Some called him the white Babe Ruth. Others called Babe Ruth the white. They called Josh Gibson the black Babe Ruth. They called Babe Ruth the white Josh Gibson, Leroy Satchel Paige, and so many others who were absolutely tremendous players. but they created an economy. And my hope and my prayer is that we will tell our own story and be inspired by that story to know that if it could be done before, it can be done again. And we can be the determinants of our own destiny. This is Dr. DZ Cofield for Real World, Real Talk, signing off. Listen, we're going to be back next week to continue our discussion with Mr. Bob Kendrick on this station, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial and KTSUradio.com, and on the Real World, Real Talk podcast network. Until next time, God bless is my prayer.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real World, Real Talk. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified of new episodes every week. Follow us via social media using the @RWRTDZ username on all platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To submit any comments, questions, sponsor opportunities, or future show suggestions, visit us online at rwrtdz.com or via email at info@rwrtdz.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you've been inspired to be the change you want to see in the world today. Until next time, be real, keep it real, and stay real.